You know what kills most preppers in a real collapse? Their own plan. They stockpile 2 years of food and think they're safe. They buy land in Montana and think they're isolated. They cache weapons and think they're defended. Then the collapse actually happens, and they discover what the Great Depression already taught us. Stockpiles run out. Remote property becomes a target. Weapons don't grow food. Between 1929 and 1939, America experienced the closest thing to a WW3-style collapse we've ever seen. 25% unemployment, bank failures, supply chain disintegration, millions starving. The people who survived weren't the ones with the most resources. They were the ones with 7 specific skills that let them extract survival from an environment that was actively trying to kill them. Hobo skills, Depression-era knowledge that modern preppers have completely forgotten in favor of gear fetishism and tactical cosplay. Let me show you what actually works when everything else fails. Most people think hobos were just homeless drifters, dirty men who chose not to work. Romantic vagabonds riding the rails for adventure. That's the mythology. Here's the reality. During the Great Depression, unemployment hit 25%. That's 1 in 4 working Americans suddenly without income, without prospects, without options. Banks failed, farms foreclosed, factories shuttered, and the men who lost everything didn't just sit at home and starve, they moved. Between 1929 and 1939, over 2 million people rode the freight trains looking for work, food, survival. These weren't bums. These were skilled tradesmen, experienced farmers, World War I veterans, men who knew how to weld, carpenter, harvest, build, men with families they were trying to feed. The economy collapsed underneath them, and they adapted. The hobo culture that emerged wasn't random chaos. It was organized. Hobo jungles sprang up near railroad yards in every major city. Temporary camps where dozens or hundreds of men would gather, share information, pool resources. These jungles had rules, hierarchies, systems for newcomers to learn what worked and what got you killed. The experienced hobos taught the new ones. Which railroad bulls would beat you? Which towns would feed you? Which routes were safe? How to start a fire in a tin can? Where to find edible plants along the tracks? How to approach a farmhouse without getting shot? They even developed a visual language, the Hobo Code, chalk symbols left on fence posts and buildings. A cat meant a kind woman lived there. An X meant don't stop here. A triangle with hands meant the homeowner had a gun. This was survival information encoded into the infrastructure itself. Here's why this matters for you. The skill set hobos developed wasn't about abundance. It was about extracting survival from an environment that offered nothing. No supply chains, no social safety net. No guarantee that the next town wouldn't run you off at gunpoint. That's the exact scenario you face in a WW3 collapse. The grid goes down, the trucks stop, the store's empty, and you're in a hostile environment where most people view you as a competitor for scarce resources. Modern preppers study wilderness survival. They prepare for the woods. Hobos survived in America's industrial landscape using America's own infrastructure against itself. They mastered urban and rural resource extraction simultaneously. That's the knowledge you actually need. We identified 7 core skills from the Hobo playbook, skills that translate directly to grid-down America. Let me show you what they are and why they work. Skill number 7, invisible camp selection. Hobos couldn't afford to be seen. Railroad bulls would beat you unconscious and throw you off moving trains. Town sheriffs would arrest you for vagrancy. Locals would chase you off their property with dogs, or worse. So hobos developed a systematic approach to choosing where to sleep. The criteria were specific. Near water, always. A stream or river for drinking and washing. Close enough to railroad tracks to catch the next freight, but far enough that passing trains wouldn't draw attention to your location. Natural concealment. Trees, brush, abandoned buildings, anything that broke the sightline from roads or paths. Multiple escape routes. Never camp anywhere with only one way out. Modern application is direct. In a grid-down scenario, you need to move through populated areas to access resources without becoming a target. That means knowing how to identify locations where you can rest, regroup, or hide without detection. Most preppers think they'll head to the wilderness. Wrong. Resources are in populated areas: food warehouses, pharmacies, hardware stores, water treatment facilities. You need to operate near these assets while remaining invisible to the desperate mobs and organized groups competing for the same resources. Study your local area now. Identify the spaces between. Drainage culverts, abandoned industrial sites, overgrown lots, railroad easements. The places nobody looks because they serve no function in normal times. These become your safe havens when everything collapses. Skill number 6. Opportunistic foraging. Hobos ate anything edible: dandelions, cattails, acorns, wild onions, pokeweed shoots. They'd walk railroad tracks looking for spilled grain from freight cars. They'd dig through restaurant trash for day-old bread. They'd catch crawfish in streams, hunt rabbits with improvised snares, steal vegetables from gardens at night. The modern prepper focuses on stockpiling: bags of rice, cans of beans, freeze-dried meals. That works until it runs out. Then what? Hobos understood caloric opportunism. Every environment contains food if you know what to look for and aren't precious about where it comes from. Urban environments are especially rich. Municipal parks have edible landscaping: ornamental crab apples, ginkgo nuts, mulberries. Storm drains collect runoff with fish and crawfish. Restaurant dumpsters get filled nightly. Grocery store loading docks leak product. The skill is recognition. Can you identify 20 different edible plants in your region? Do you know which parts are toxic and which are safe? Can you field dress a squirrel? Most preppers can't. Hobos could. That's why they survived indefinitely, while families with pantries starved after 6 months. The first 2 skills keep you hidden and fed short-term, but survival beyond 30 days requires something harder. Social navigation. Skill number 5. Reading people and places. Hobos couldn't just knock on random doors asking for food. That got you shot in half of Depression-era America. So they developed a system for evaluating threat before engagement. They'd watch a house from a distance. Is there a dog? Are there children's toys in the yard? Is the property well maintained or falling apart? Does smoke come from the chimney? Each data point informed the risk calculation. Children meant the woman of the house might have maternal instincts. Well-maintained property meant resources to share. Smoke meant someone was home and cooking, which meant possible food. The Hobo code gave them additional intelligence. Those chalk symbols weren't decorative. They were survival data. A house marked with a cross meant Christian people who might help. A circle with 2 arrows meant get out fast. A square with a diagonal line meant the owner would give you work for food. Hobos read the infrastructure and made informed decisions about where to approach and where to avoid. Modern application is more complex because the collapse will be violent. You're not asking for charity. You're navigating a landscape where everyone is a potential threat and resources are contested. Can you read body language well enough to identify desperation versus aggression? Can you spot which houses are already abandoned versus which are defended? Can you tell the difference between a community that might trade versus a group that will take what you have? Skill number 4. Strategic integration. Here's what nobody tells you about lone wolf survival. It doesn't work. Hobos understood this instinctively. The men who survived the Depression weren't the ones who isolated themselves. They were the ones who integrated into hobo jungles, who shared information and resources, who contributed skills to the collective. A hobo who could cook got fed by hobos who could hunt. A hobo who could repair clothes got protected by hobos who could fight. The hobo jungle wasn't charity. It was mutual advantage. Everyone brought something. The guy who knew which freight lines were hiring. The guy who could treat infections with improvised remedies. The guy who could play harmonica and keep morale up. These micro-communities formed stabilized, and persisted because they recognized a fundamental truth. Individual humans are fragile. Groups are resilient. In a WW3 collapse, you need to identify and join functional communities fast. Not preppers in bunkers. Actual groups with diverse skills and shared survival interests. The question is what you bring to the table that makes you worth keeping alive. You're hidden, fed, socially integrated. None of that matters if you can't handle the weather. Skill number 3. Thermal regulation without technology. Hobos rode in unheated freight cars through Montana winters. They slept under bridges in January. They crossed the Southwest in July with no air conditioning, no shade, no relief. Exposure killed thousands. Hypothermia, heat stroke, frostbite. The hobos who survived weren't tougher. They knew the principles. The I for cold. Insulation is everything. Hobos would stuff newspaper inside their clothes. 10 sheets of newsprint between your shirt and your skin creates an air gap that holds body heat. They'd layer anything available. Burlap sacks, cardboard, stolen. The material didn't matter. Air pockets mattered. They'd build fires inside tin cans. Punch holes near the bottom for airflow. Fill it with scrap wood or coal, and you have a portable heater that won't fill your shelter with smoke. They'd sleep in groups. 5 men sharing body heat in a boxcar will survive temperatures that would kill each of them alone. For heat, the principle is the opposite. Evaporative cooling. Hobos in the Southwest would wet their shirts and let the wind dry them. Temporary relief, but enough to prevent heat stroke. They'd travel at night and sleep during the day in any shade they could find. Culverts under bridges, abandoned buildings. They'd ration water carefully. One canteen had to last until the next source. No waste. Modern preppers assume they'll have their gear. Sleeping bags rated to -20 degrees. Propane heaters. Climate-controlled shelters. Then they lose their kit in the chaos. Or it gets stolen. Or they're forced to move and can only carry what fits in a backpack. Suddenly the gear is gone, and they don't know the principles. How many layers do you need at 20 degrees Fahrenheit to survive the night? Do you know how to build a Dakota fire hole that produces maximum heat with minimal smoke and light signature? Can you identify the signs of hypothermia in yourself before you lose motor function? These aren't theoretical questions. In a grid-down winter, these are the questions that determine whether you wake up. Hobos knew the answers because they lived them. They learned through trial and error. And the ones who made errors died. You don't have the luxury of that learning curve. You need the knowledge now before the crisis, because the grid-down scenario won't give you a practice round. We've covered the physical skills. Now the one that actually determines who lives. Skill number 2. Psychological endurance. Depression-era America saw suicide rates spike 20% between 1929 and 1932. Men who lost their businesses, their farms, their identities. They couldn't adapt to the new reality. They'd built their entire self-concept around being providers, landowners, respectable citizens. When the economy took that away, they had nothing left. So they stepped in front of trains or put guns in their mouths. The hobos who survived weren't necessarily stronger. They were more adaptable mentally. They'd already accepted the loss. No more stability. No more status. No more comfort. That mental framework freed them to do whatever it took to survive without the psychological burden of what they used to be. They practiced radical acceptance. Today, I'm hungry. Tomorrow, I might eat. There's no point catastrophizing about next week when I don't know if I'll survive tonight. This wasn't optimism. It was pragmatic present focus. Deal with the immediate threat. Conserve mental energy. Don't waste emotional bandwidth on things you can't control. They also maintained purpose. The hobo riding the rails wasn't drifting aimlessly. He was looking for work in the next town, trying to save money to send home, searching for a cousin who might have a lead on employment. That forward momentum, even if it led nowhere, kept the mind engaged. Depression and despair come from stagnation. Movement, even pointless movement, fights that. Modern preppers obsess over physical preparedness and completely ignore mental conditioning. They stockpile calories but don't prepare for the psychological warfare of watching neighbors starve while they eat. They plan for resource scarcity, but not for the grief of losing family members to violence or disease. They prepare to fight, but not to endure months of grinding uncertainty and fear. Here's the truth. Nobody wants to hear. Your mind will break before your body does. Starvation takes weeks. Dehydration takes days. Psychological collapse can happen in hours. The moment you decide it's not worth fighting anymore, you're already dead. The actual dying just takes a little longer. Hobos developed mental toughness not through motivation or positive thinking, but through necessity. They were forced to confront loss, uncertainty, and degradation daily until it became normal. You won't have that gradual exposure. The collapse will be sudden. Either you've conditioned yourself mentally beforehand, or you'll break when it matters most. Can you function while experiencing sustained fear? Can you make rational decisions while grieving? Can you maintain discipline when there's no external structure forcing you to? These are the questions that separate survivors from casualties. Let's pause here. Some of you are thinking, why learn any of this when I can just stockpile 2 years of food and water and ride out the collapse from my property? Fair question. Let's do the math. Average American needs 2,000 calories per day. That's 730,000 calories per year. For a family of 4, that's 2.9 million calories for 1 year. Most prepper food averages around 1,500 calories per pound. You need approximately 2,000 pounds of food per person per year. For a family of 4, that's 4 tons of food. Where are you storing 4 tons of food? How are you keeping it secure? What happens when your neighbors realize you have it? Here's what history teaches us. During every collapse, the people with stockpiles became targets. Kulaks in the Soviet Union were systematically robbed and murdered for their grain stores. Chinese landowners during the Great Leap Forward were killed for hoarding food. Even in Depression-era America, farms with full silos got raided by desperate mobs. Stockpiles are static. They can't adapt, they can't move, they draw attention, they run out, and when they run out, you're left with nothing because you spent all your time guarding resources instead of developing skills. Compare that to the Hobo model. No stockpile, just knowledge, the ability to extract calories from any environment. That skill doesn't run out. It doesn't attract raiders. It goes wherever you go. It compounds. The more you practice foraging, the better you get. The better you get, the more efficiently you can feed yourself. The gear-focused prepper plateaus the day his stockpile is full. The skill-focused survivor keeps improving. Skills are anti-fragile. Stress makes them stronger. Stockpiles are fragile. One fire, one raid, one mistake, and everything is gone. You get one chance to choose which model you're building your survival strategy around. Choose correctly. And now, the skill that matters most. The one that separates the 1% who make it from everyone else. Skill number 1. Adaptive improvisation. Hobos had nothing. No tools, no materials, no workshop. Everything they needed, they built from scrap. Fishing hooks from bent nails. Knives from railroad spikes heated in fires and hammered against rocks. Shelter from scavenged lumber and tar paper. Cooking pots from discarded cans. They looked at trash and saw resources. They looked at problems and invented solutions. This wasn't creativity for its own sake. It was survival necessity converted into systematic problem solving. A hobo needed a way to cook food without carrying a pot. Solution: flatten a tin can, fold the edges, use it as a pan. Need to carry water without a canteen? Find a glass bottle, wrap it in cloth to prevent breaking. Need to repair torn clothing without needle and thread? Use wire or plant fibers. The modern prepper buys a solution for every problem. Multi-tool, first aid kit, water filter, fire starter. Then loses it all in the first week of chaos and doesn't know how to function. The Hobo started with nothing and built everything from environmental materials. This is the master skill because it makes everything else possible. You can't forage effectively without tools to process food. You can't maintain thermal regulation without the ability to improvise insulation. You can't integrate into communities without offering useful skills, and improvisation is always useful. Here's the test. Right now, go outside with nothing but the clothes you're wearing. Can you start a fire? Can you purify water? Can you build a shelter that keeps you dry? Can you create a cutting tool? Can you make cordage from plants? If the answer is no, you don't have this skill yet. And without this skill, everything else is temporary. Gear runs out. Improvisation is infinite. 7 skills, each one learnable. But here's the reality nobody wants to hear. Knowing these skills doesn't mean you can execute them. Reading about how to identify edible plants is not the same as actually foraging a meal. Understanding the principles of thermal regulation is not the same as surviving a winter night with newspaper insulation. Knowledge is the starting point. Ability requires practice. Here's your action plan. Start with Skill 7. This week, identify 3 invisible camp locations within 5 miles of your house. Actually go there. Evaluate sightlines, water access, escape routes. Get the pattern recognition built into your brain now. Move to Skill 6. Learn 10 edible plants in your region. Not from YouTube. Go outside and find them. Harvest them. Eat them. Know what they taste like, where they grow, what seasons they're available. Dedicate 1 month to each remaining skill. Build fires from improvised materials until you can do it in under 5 minutes. Practice reading people in normal interactions. Join a community group now, before the collapse, and learn how to contribute value. Test your cold weather gear by spending a night outside with progressively less equipment until you know your actual limits. Timeline matters. You need 6 months minimum to develop basic competency across all 7 skills. A year is better. Most preppers will realize this too late, after the collapse has already started and the window for safe practice has closed. The Great Depression lasted a decade. The men who survived weren't the strongest or the richest. They were the most adaptable. They learned skills that let them extract survival from environments that offered nothing. You have the same choice they did: stockpile gear and hope it lasts, or develop capabilities that compound forever. 7 skills, 6 months to learn. 1 chance to get this right before everything changes. The collapse won't wait for you to be ready.